The gavel of accusation that Charlotte Wainwright brought down that morning was not made of wood but of paper, and she held it high enough for every soul crowded outside the Canyon Creek Bridge House to see. "This deed is a forgery, Mr. Prout," she said, her voice carrying clean and hard across the packed dirt square, "and I intend to prove it before every rancher in this valley loses what my father spent 20 years building." Silas Prout stood on the porch of the toll office in his gray broadcloth suit, a man who had shaken every important hand in the territory and never once let his smile slip. It did not slip now. "Miss Wainwright," he said gently, the way a man speaks to a child throwing a tantrum in church, "grief does strange things to a young woman's mind. Your father sold the water rights to the Canyon Trust Land Company 8 months before he passed. I have his signature right here." "You have a signature," Charlotte said. "Whether it is his is another matter entirely," the crowd murmured. Early June had brought the valley alive with dust and noise. Wagons rattling down from the high pastures, drovers pushing bawling cattle toward the bridge that was the only dry crossing of Copper Gorge for 40 miles in either direction. And every one of those travelers now slowed their teams to watch a slight young woman in a gray traveling dress stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful man in Canyon Creek. Walter Norris had ridden into town not 20 minutes before, road dust caked to his hat brim, a folded letter from the Canyon Creek Cattlemen's Association in his saddlebag, asking him to find whoever had been running off horses from 3 separate spreads along the gorge. He had meant to find the livery, water his gelding, and ask after the sheriff. Instead, he found himself reining up at the edge of a crowd, watching a woman hold a piece of paper toward the sun like she meant to burn a hole through it with her eyes alone. He was close enough to see what she saw. The document trembled slightly in her grip, and even from 10 feet back, Walter could make out that the ink of the signature sat darker and glossier than the ink of the body text above it, as though someone had written the deed itself with an old pen and gone back later with a new one to add the name at the bottom. He had spent 3 days tracking a shod horse with a nicked rear shoe from the Bar W range clear across 2 county lines, and he had seen that same peculiar bright black ink before, on a bill of sale nailed to a fence post outside the very corral where the stolen stock had been hidden. It was not a common ink. It came from a bottle sold at exactly one mercantile that Walter knew of, 40 miles east in Larkspur Station, and Silas Prout's land company kept an account there. He did not say any of that yet. He only sat his horse and watched the woman argue with the man who owned half the town, and something in him, some old habit built from years of reading trail sign and knowing a true track from a false one, told him she was not wrong. "Show me proof, then," Prout said, spreading his hands for the crowd's benefit. "Show me proof, Miss Wainwright, and I will tear this deed up myself. Until then, I will thank you not to slander a man's good name in the public square." "I intend to have proof within the week," Charlotte said, "and when I do, I expect you to make good on that promise in front of every witness standing here today." "The week," Prout said, and something flickered behind his practiced smile, gone as fast as it came, "is a generous amount of time. I look forward to it." He turned and went back inside the toll house, and the crowd began to break apart into knots of whispering, and Charlotte Wainwright stood alone in the square with her paper still raised, breathing hard, looking for a moment like she might cry and deciding, visibly, that she would not. Walter swung down from his horse and led it toward the water trough near where she stood, close enough to speak without shouting. "That ink," he said, "the black in the signature, I have seen it before, recently." She turned, startled, and looked him over the way a woman looks over a stranger who has interrupted a private moment, taking in the trail dust, the worn chaps, the sun-cracked hands on the reins. Whatever she saw did not impress her overmuch. "Have you?" she said, in a tone that suggested she doubted a saddle tramp could tell the difference between ink and axle grease. "Yes, ma'am. On a bill of sale out at an old line shack up in the rocks above Miller's Crossing. Same bright shine to it. Most ink out here dries flat and dull inside a week. This dries with a shine that never quite goes away. It is a fountain pen ink, not the kind most folks dip a steel nib in. Charlotte's eyes narrowed, and for the first time she looked at him properly, not as an interruption but as a man who had said something worth hearing. "Who are you?" "Walter Norris. I drive cattle for a living, and lately I have been hired by your Cattlemen's Association to find the man stealing horses out of this valley." "Then you and I," Charlotte Wainwright said slowly, "may have more business together than either of us expected this morning." She did not invite him to sit, not at first. She led him instead down the packed street to a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign reading Wainwright's Fine Sewing and Alterations, and she set the deed down on a cutting table between bolts of calico and a hand-crank sewing machine gleaming black and gold in the window light. "My father built the Wainwright ranch out of nothing," she said, once the door was shut behind them. 1,400 head at the last count, and water rights that go back to before the territory was even surveyed. He died last October, Mr. Norris, of a fever that took him in 11 days, and I came home from Denver to bury him and found Silas Prout already sitting in the front parlor of our own house with a lawyer and a document claiming my father had sold the creek rights to his company the previous spring. And you do not believe he did? I do not believe it because my father wrote to me every single week I was away at my dressmaking apprenticeship, and in March of last year he wrote to tell me the drought had broken and the herd would winter fat for the first time in 3 years. A man does not sell the water that saved his cattle 2 months before he brags about the grass it grew. She tapped the deed. And I do not believe it because that is not his hand. My father wrote in a slow, heavy scrawl, Mr. Norris, the hand of a man who broke horses for a living before he ever held a pen. This signature is too smooth, too practiced. Walter leaned over the table, studying the page without touching it, the way a man studies a track he does not want to smudge before reading everything it has to tell him. "You have a good eye for a seamstress." "I have a good eye because I spend 12 hours a day matching thread to a swatch by lamplight," Charlotte said, a little sharply. "I promise you, sir, there is no finer training for noticing when something does not belong than a needle and a bolt of cloth." I did not mean it as an insult. Most men do not mean it as one. They simply cannot help sounding like it is. He almost smiled at that, and something in his chest eased at the sound of her temper, quick and clean as a whip crack, nothing helpless in it at all. "I have been 3 days on the trail of a horse thief who has hit the Bar W, the Circle T, and one of your own line camps in the last 2 weeks. Whoever he is riding a horse with a shoe nicked on the near hind, and he is keeping the stolen stock somewhere up in the rocks past Miller's Crossing, because that is where the tracks lead before they scatter into shale I cannot follow." "That is Wainwright land," Charlotte said quietly. "That whole shelf above the crossing belonged to my father." "Then perhaps," Walter said, "the man stealing your horses and the man forging your father's name work for the same company." Charlotte was quiet a long moment, looking down at the deed, at the bright false shine of that signature. When she looked up again, there was something steady and fierce in her face that made Walter revise, quietly and without announcement to himself, every assumption he had made about a fine-dressed woman with soft hands and a sewing machine in her front window. "I already found the corral, Mr. Norris," she said, 3 days ago. I rode up past the crossing myself with my father's old rifle across my saddle, and I counted 9 head of stolen horses penned in a box canyon behind a rockfall, with a fresh brand burned right over the Bar W mark on 2 of them. I was going to go back this week with proof enough to bring the sheriff. It seems you have been chasing the same ghost I already caught up to." For a moment Walter simply looked at her, and then, despite himself, he laughed, a short surprised sound that seemed to startle them both. "Well," he said, "I reckon I have ridden 200 miles to be beaten to my own job by a dressmaker." "I would remind you," Charlotte said, though her mouth had begun to twitch at the corner, "that dressmakers are frequently underestimated, and it has served me well so far." "I am starting to understand that," Walter said, and meant it. They rode out together the next morning, before the sun had burned the last of the cold off the canyon rim. Charlotte on a sturdy buckskin mare she called Juniper, and Walter on the rangy sorrel gelding he had ridden up from Texas the summer before. She rode astride in a split canvas skirt she had sewn herself for exactly this purpose. And when Walter noted the practicality of it, she informed him, without any particular heat, that a woman who intended to survive in this country learned early that fashion and function were not always at war, and that a good seamstress could arrange for both. The trail above Miller's Crossing climbed through a stand of lodgepole pine before breaking out onto bare rock, switchbacking up a shelf that overlooked the whole silver ribbon of the Copper River far below. Walter watched her handle the mare on the narrow stretches, watched the easy, competent way she read the ground for loose shale, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a ready name for. "Your father taught you to ride like this?" he asked. "My father taught me everything a son would have learned, Mr. Norris, on account of my mother died bringing me into the world, and he never remarried. I could rope a calf before I could sew a straight seam. The sewing I picked up later, in Denver, because a woman needs a trade that will feed her if the men in her life insist on leaving her too soon." There was no self-pity in the way she said it, only a plain accounting of facts, and Walter found himself wanting unreasonably to know more of the story behind it. They came around the last switchback and Charlotte reined in, lifting a hand. "There," she said low, "past that rockfall. Do not ride any closer, the ground carries sound worse than you would think." Walter dismounted and moved forward on foot, keeping to the shadow of the rocks, and Charlotte came with him without asking permission, moving just as quietly, her rifle already out of its scabbard and resting easy in the crook of her arm. Below them, in a hidden box canyon walled on three sides by sheer red rock, 9 horses grazed inside a rough pole corral, and near a lean-to shelter a man crouched over a small cook-fare. A Winchester leaned against a stone beside him. "That is not Silas Prout," Walter murmured. "No," Charlotte said. "I do not know him, but look at his saddle." Walter looked, and there on the fender, branded deep into the leather, was a stylized letter C over a T Canyon Trust, he said quietly. "That is company tack." "Which means," Charlotte said, "that whoever that man is, he did not steal these horses to sell them for his own profit. He stole them because someone paid him to." They watched a while longer, and Walter noted the man's horse tied nearby, noted the rear shoe with its telltale nick, confirming 3 days of tracking in a single glance. He was working out how best to approach, whether to circle wide and come at the camp from the rock side where the man would have no clear shot, when a stone shifted somewhere behind them and a voice cut through the morning stillness like a rifle bolt sliding home. "I would not move another inch if I were the two of you." Walter turned, slow, his hand not quite reaching his revolver, to find 2 riders sitting their horses on the trail behind them, rifles already leveled. The lead rider was a broad, flat-faced man with a foreman's vest and a scar through one eyebrow, and Walter recognized the look of a man who had done this kind of work before and did not mind doing it again. "Garrett Voss," Charlotte said, and there was no fear in her voice, only a cold recognition. "Mr. Prout's foreman. I should have guessed you would be riding nursemaid to his stolen horses." "Miss Wainwright," Voss said, touching his hat brim with mocking courtesy. "You do have a habit of turning up where you are not wanted. Mr. Prout warned me you might come poking around up here again. I did not expect you would bring company." "I am not company," Walter said evenly. "I am hired by the Cattlemen's Association to find the man stealing horses out of this valley, and it looks to me like I have found him, along with the man who sent him." "Is that so?" Voss's smile did not reach his eyes. "Well, cowboy, seeing as you have found what you were looking for, I expect you will want to ride on down and report it. Only I cannot have that happen just yet, on account of Mr. Prout has business to conclude first, and it would go easier on the both of you if you turned around right now and rode back the way you came." "And if we do not?" Charlotte asked. "Then Amos down there might mistake you for the horse thief himself, mister." Norris, and put a bullet through you before anyone sorts out the confusion. Accidents happen up in these rocks all the time. Ask anybody." Walter felt the old cold clarity settle over him that came before trouble, the same feeling he got when a stampede started building on the far side of a herd, and he had about 4 seconds to decide which way to turn his horse. He glanced sideways at Charlotte, and found her already watching Voss's men with the flat, measuring look of someone counting angles and cover, not an ounce of panic in her. "There is a man down in that camp who works for Prout," Walter said loudly enough to carry down into the canyon, "stealing horses to frame honest ranchers as thieves. I expect the territorial judge over in Larkspur Station would find that mighty interesting testimony should it ever reach him." "It will not reach him," Voss said, "because you are not leaving these rocks to carry it." "Now," Charlotte said quietly, and Walter did not need telling twice. He dropped and rolled behind the boulder at his left as her rifle cracked, the shot going high and wide over Voss's head, not meant to kill but to spook the horses, and it worked exactly as she intended, both mounts rearing and screaming, their riders fighting for control instead of aim. Walter came up with his revolver drawn and put a shot into the dirt at the second rider's feet, close enough to make the point without making a widow, and in the chaos of plunging horses and shouting men, he grabbed Charlotte's arm. "Down the back way there is a game trail," she gasped, already moving. "I scouted it 3 days ago." They went half sliding, half running down a narrow crease in the rock that no horse could have followed, Voss's shouted curses fading above them, a wild shot ringing off stone somewhere too close for comfort, and then they were down in the timber breathing hard, Charlotte's hand still locked around Walter's forearm from where she had pulled him along. "You planned an escape route before you ever came up here with me," Walter said, half laughing despite the pounding of his own heart. "I told you, Mr. Norris. I already found this corral 3 days ago. A woman who rides alone into country like this without a way back out again is a woman who does not intend to grow old." She let go of his arm at last, though her fingers lingered a half-second longer than they needed to, and Walter found he did not mind that at all. They did not go back to town by the main trail. Charlotte led them along a game path that skirted the gorge a mile downstream, and they came out at last onto a bluff overlooking the river where the bridge and the ferry landing both lay visible below, tiny as toys, the water running high and brown with the last of the mountain snowmelt. "That ferry only runs when the water is too high for the ford," Charlotte said, catching her breath at last, nodding down at the ramshackle raft tethered on the far bank. "And that bridge is the only crossing for cattle for 40 miles either direction. Prout built it 11 years ago, before I was even old enough to remember, and the town council granted him the toll rights in perpetuity. Every drive that comes through this pass pays him a fee per head, every wagon of trade goods, every family moving west. That is a fair amount of power for one man to hold over an entire valley," Walter said. "It is the entire reason he wants my father's water rights," Charlotte said. "If he controls the bridge and he controls the only reliable creek water on this side of the gorge, he can set whatever price he likes on grazing, on crossing, on everything. Half the ranchers in this valley are already leasing water from his company because their own creeks ran dry 2 summers back. My father's spread is one of the last that still has an independent claim strong enough to hold out against him. Which is why he needs your deed to be real." "Which is why he needs my deed to be real," Charlotte agreed. "And why, now that we have seen his hired man stealing horses to plant evidence against innocent ranch hands, I expect he will move faster than he otherwise might have. A cornered man does not wait patiently for the noose to tighten." She looked over at Walter, and there was something searching in her expression now, something that had not been there in the town square that morning. "You believed me. This morning in the square, before you had any proof beyond a bottle of ink. You believed me. I have spent 10 years reading sign on the trail, Miss Wainwright. A false track always looks a little too smooth if you know what to look for. That deed looked wrong to me the same way a horse looks wrong when it has been shod by a man in a hurry. I did not need to know you to see it. Most men in this valley, Charlotte said, have needed rather a lot of convincing. Then most men in this valley, Walter said, have not spent enough time looking at hoofprints. She laughed then, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and something about the sound of it settled warm in Walter's chest and stayed there the rest of the ride back to town. The week Prout had granted her did not pass quietly. 2 nights later, Charlotte woke to the smell of coal oil and smoke, and came down the stairs of her shop in her nightgown to find a fire already climbing the front window display. A bolt of good wool cloth blazing where someone had thrown a lit lamp through the glass. She beat it back with a wet quilt and a bucket from the rain barrel before it could take the whole building, coughing in the smoke, her hands blistered. And by the time the town's bucket brigade arrived, the fire was out, but her front window was shattered and half a month's inventory ruined. Walter arrived at a run, having heard the shouting from the room he had taken above the livery, and found her sitting on the boardwalk in her scorched nightgown, wrapped in someone's borrowed coat, staring at the wreckage of her shop with a face gone pale and still. "I am not hurt," she said before he could ask. "Only angry. Someone wanted to frighten me into dropping my claim before the week is out." "Did you see who it was?" "No, but I do not need to see him to know who sent him." She looked up at Walter, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw the mask of composure slip, just for a moment, into something rower and more frightened than she likely wanted anyone to witness. "I have almost nothing left, Mr. Norris. The ranch is tied up in a legal claim I cannot afford to fight in a proper courtroom. This shop was the only thing keeping food on my table and a roof that was mine to lose. If they burn this to the ground, I do not know what I have left to stand on." Walter crouched down in front of her, close enough that she had to look at him instead of the ruined shop. "You have witnesses now," he said. "You have me, and I have seen Voss and a stolen horse camp with my own eyes. You have a bottle of ink that does not match your father's hand, and you have a woman's memory of a letter written the very month that deed claims he sold his water rights out from under his own cattle. That is not nothing, Charlotte." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it, something flickering behind her exhausted eyes. "You have more courage in your little finger," Walter went on, "than most men I have driven a herd alongside, and I have driven with some hard men. Whoever threw that lamp through your window did not do it because you are weak. He did it because you are winning, and Silas Prout is frightened of what happens if this week runs out with you still standing." Charlotte was quiet a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, she reached out and gripped his hand where it rested on his knee, her burned fingers rough against his calloused ones. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not treating me like glass." "I made that mistake once already," Walter admitted. "The morning I met you, standing there thinking a woman with soft hands and a sewing machine could not possibly have already solved the very case I was hired to solve. I do not intend to make it twice." She almost smiled, even through the ruin around them. "See that you do not, Mr. Norris. I find I have grown rather fond of proving men wrong." The sheriff of Canyon Creek, a heavy-set, tired man named Dale Hutchins, listened to their account of the hidden corral and the burned shop with an expression that suggested he believed every word and wished fervently that he did not have to act on any of it. "Silas Prout sits on the town council," Hutchins said, turning his hat in his hands in the cramped little jailhouse office. "He funded the schoolhouse. He built that bridge with his own money, whatever else you want to say about the tolls. I cannot go arrest a man like that on the strength of a bottle of ink and a story about riders in the rocks, Miss Wainwright, not without something a judge would call proof." "Then come with us and see the horse camp yourself," Walter said. "See the Canyon Trust brand on that man's saddle. See the stolen stock with fresh brands burned over the old marks." "I would," Hutchins said, "except Garrett Voss rode down out of those rocks yesterday evening and swore out a complaint against the both of you for trespass and for firing on his men. Says you two rustled the horses up there yourselves and got caught doing it." He held up a hand before either of them could protest. "I do not believe him, understand. But he has witnesses, and you have a stolen bottle of ink for evidence, and until that changes I am going to have a hard time telling the circuit judge who to arrest." "That is absurd," Charlotte said, her voice rising. "You know me, Dale Hutchins. You have known me since I was a girl of 10 riding into town behind my father's saddle. I know you, Miss Wainwright, and I am sorry for it, but knowing a person is not evidence a judge will accept, and Silas Prout has already been to see me twice this morning asking after a warrant for Mr. Norris here." Hutchins looked genuinely pained. "I have to hold him, at least until the circuit judge comes through next week. I am sorry, but that is the law as it stands." Walter did not resist when Hutchins took his revolver and led him back toward the single cramped cell at the rear of the jailhouse, though his jaw was tight with the injustice of it. Charlotte stood in the front office, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, watching the iron door swing shut. "I will get you out of there," she said through the bars, once Hutchins had stepped back out front to deal with a drunk cowhand hollering in the street. "I promise you that, Walter Norris." "I believe you," Walter said, and found, a little to his own surprise, that he did. She did not waste the days that followed. Charlotte Wainwright had spent 3 years in Canyon Creek, building a clientele of nearly every respectable woman in the valley, sewing wedding dresses and christening gowns and mourning blacks. And in that time she had heard more secrets over pincushions and hemlines than most men heard in a lifetime of gossip at the saloon. She called on the wife of the bank manager first, then the wife of the mercantile owner, then the schoolteacher who boarded above the post office, and she did not ask any of them for charity. She asked them to remember. "You told me once," she said to Mrs. Original Prudence Aldercott, the banker's wife, as she pinned a new hem, "that your husband mentioned Silas Prout had opened an account for ink and stationery supplies at the Larkspur Mercantile last spring, larger than any order he had placed before or since. Would you swear to that if it came to it?" "I would," Mrs. Aldercott said slowly, "though I do not know what business it is of anyone's what ink a man buys." "It is a great deal of business," Charlotte said. "If that ink was used to forge my father's signature on a deed that never should have existed." Word moved through Canyon Creek the way it always did, quietly at first and then all at once, carried on the same threads Charlotte had spent years weaving into the fabric of the town. By the third day, a dozen small facts had gathered themselves into a shape too large to ignore. The unusual ink order, a stagecoach driver who recalled that Thomas Wainwright had been laid up with fever the entire month. The deed claimed he had ridden to Larkspur Station to sign it. A store clerk who remembered no such visit from the rancher that spring at all. But facts alone, Charlotte knew, would not be enough while Amos Teague, the frightened man from the hidden corral, remained silent and afraid up in Prout's employ, the one witness who could speak directly to what Voss and Prout had ordered him to do. She found him herself, on the 4th day, in the back corner of the Canyon Creek saloon, nursing a whiskey he could not afford, a haunted, hollow-eyed young man not much older than herself. "I know who you are," she said, sitting down across from him without invitation, "and I know what you have been made to do. I am not here to see you hanged for it, Mr. Teague. I am here because I think you did not want to do it in the first place." Amos Teague's hands shook around his glass. "I owed money," he said finally, barely above a whisper. "Gambling debts over in Larkspur. Voss came to me with an offer to clear the whole amount if I would move some horses around and keep quiet about who told me to. Said it was just moving stock, nothing more. I did not know he meant to hang a rustling charge on the Bar W hands, not until it was already done and I could not walk it back without hanging myself alongside them." "You can walk it back now," Charlotte said gently. "You can tell the truth to the sheriff in front of witnesses, and I promise you I will speak for you myself when it comes to any charge against you. But you have to decide now tonight, because a good man is sitting in that jail cell for a crime you committed, and I do not intend to let him hang for it." Amos Teague looked at her a long time, his young face torn between fear of Prut and something that looked at last like the beginning of shame catching up to him. "All right," he said finally hoarse. "All right, Miss Wainwright, I will tell it, all of it." The telling of it when it came was not tidy. Amos Teague walked into the sheriff's office the next morning with Charlotte beside him and gave his account in a shaking voice while Hutchins wrote it down. And within an hour, Walter Norris walked free of the cell, blinking in the sunlight, to find Charlotte waiting for him on the boardwalk with an expression of fierce, undisguised relief. "You did it," Walter said. "You actually did it." "We did it," Charlotte corrected. "I could not have found Amos Teague's conscience without your evidence sitting alongside mine, and you could not have proven anything at all sitting in that cell." She looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, the noise of the street fading around them. "I was frightened," she admitted quietly. "The whole time you were in there. I do not frighten easily, Walter, but I was frightened for you." "I was not overly comfortable myself," Walter said, "but I never once doubted you would find a way. I have never met anyone who fights the way you fight, Charlotte Wainwright. Not with fists, though I expect you could throw a decent one if you had to. With patience and thread, and the whole town's secret stitched together into something no one can tear apart." Charlotte flushed, unused to praise delivered so plainly. "That is a strange kind of compliment, Mr. Norris." "It is the truest one I know how to give," Walter said, and reached out, hesitant, to brush a strand of hair back from her face where the wind had caught it. She did not pull away. For a long moment they simply stood there on the boardwalk, the town moving around them, something unspoken settling warm and certain between them. It was Sheriff Hutchins, stepping out of the jailhouse with Amos Teague's signed statement in hand, who broke the moment. "This is enough to bring before the territorial judge," he said. "But it will take a week for him to ride the circuit back through Canyon Creek, and I expect Silas Prut will not sit idle in the meantime." He was right to expect it. Prut did not sit idle at all. Within 2 days, notices went up along the bridge house and the mercantile wall announcing that the Canyon Trust Land Company, as majority holder of the water rights along Copper Creek, was closing the bridge to all cattle traffic effective the 15th of June, citing damage to the structure that required urgent repair, and that any drover wishing to cross before that date would need to pay a doubled toll to cover the cost. Charlotte read the notice with her jaw set tight. "There is nothing wrong with that bridge," she said. "I crossed it myself not 4 days ago. This is not about repairs. This is about strangling every rancher in this valley who has not yet agreed to sell out to him, myself included. My herd is due at Larkspur Station by the 20th, or I lose the buyer contract that would keep the ranch solvent through winter. Half the other outfits in this valley are in the same position." "And you," Walter said slowly, understanding dawning, "were counting on driving your cattle across that bridge to make the deadline." "I was counting on it because there is no other way to cross a herd of any size. The ford is too high this time of year, and the ferry can carry perhaps 6 head at a time on a good crossing, less if the current runs hard. It would take a full week just to get my herd across by ferry alone, and that is assuming Prut does not simply refuse to run it for me at all, which I would not put past him." Walter was quiet a moment, turning the situation over with the same careful attention he gave to reading Trail's sign. "I am contracted to drive a herd through for 3 different outfits already," he said finally. "Nearly 2,000 head, gathered at the base of the pass, meant to cross before the 15th as well. If Prut closes that bridge, he does not only ruin you, Charlotte. He strangles every cattleman in this valley who depends on that crossing, and he knows it, and he is counting on the ranchers turning against each other to fight over ferry space instead of turning against him." "Then we do not let him divide us," Charlotte said, something fierce and decisive coming into her face. "We bring every rancher in this valley together, Walter. We drive every herd to that bridge at once, on the day before his closure, with every witness in the county watching, and we make him choose, in front of God and the whole territory, between opening that crossing or standing, revealed for exactly the thief he is. Walter looked at her, at the fire in her, and felt something settle into place inside his chest that had been circling for 2 weeks without quite landing. "That," he said, "is either the bravest plan I have heard in 10 years of driving cattle or the most reckless." "Why not both?" Charlotte said, and for the first time in days she smiled. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparation, and it was in those days, more than any of the danger before it, that something between them shifted from partnership into something neither of them named aloud, but both of them felt, plain as sunrise. They rode from ranch to ranch together, Walter speaking cattleman to cattleman about the drive itself, the timing, the logistics of pushing nearly 3,000 head of mixed stock to a single crossing point without a stampede, while Charlotte spoke to the wives and daughters, gathering the quiet strength of the valley's women behind the men's decision, reminding them all, gently and without theatrics, exactly what Sila's Prout stood to gain if they let fear keep them silent. In the evenings, when the work was done and the horses unsaddled, they found themselves sitting together on the porch of Charlotte's half-rebuilt shop, sharing coffee and the particular exhausted ease of two people who have spent a hard day working toward the same purpose. "You never did tell me," Walter said one evening, watching the last light fade gold over the canyon rim, "why you went to Denver in the first place, to learn sewing, when you clearly had the whole ranch running through your blood already." Charlotte was quiet a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "My father wanted me to have something of my own," she said finally. "Something no bank or land company or careless husband could ever take from me. He used to say a woman who could ride and rope had a skill men respected, but a woman who could also build a business with her own 2 hands had a skill no one could ever argue her out of owning. He was not a sentimental man, my father, but he loved me fierce in his own quiet way, and I think he always feared what might happen to me if the ranch ever failed and I had nothing else to stand on. He sounds like he knew you well." "He knew me better than anyone alive," Charlotte said, and her voice caught slightly. "I miss him every single day, Walter. I do not know if that ever stops." "It does not," Walter said quietly. "I lost my own folks young to a fever that swept through our part of Texas when I was 14. I have been driving cattle and drifting from outfit to outfit ever since, taking the hardest drives because no one much minds if a man with no family gets himself killed on a bad crossing. I never had much reason to put down roots anywhere until lately." He looked at her and did not look away. "Until Canyon Creek." Charlotte's breath caught just slightly, and in the fading light Walter could see the color rise in her cheeks. "Walter Norris," she said softly, "are you telling me you are thinking of staying?" "I am telling you," Walter said, "that I have driven cattle across half this territory and never once found a reason to slow my horse down at the end of it, until I watched a dressmaker hold up a forged deed to the sun and dare the most powerful man in the valley to prove her wrong. I do not rightly know what to call what I am feeling, Charlotte, only that I have not felt it before, and I am not eager to ride away from it." She reached across the small space between them and took his hand, her fingers still faintly rough from the rope burns and needle pricks of a hard week's work, and neither of them said anything more for a long while, content simply to sit together in the deepening dark, the whole valley quiet around them, gathering its strength for the fight to come. The day before the bridge was to close, ranchers from every corner of the valley began driving their herds down toward Canyon Creek, the dust of 1,000 hooves rising gold in the June morning light, bawling cattle and shouting drovers filling the narrow canyon road, until it seemed the whole world had converged on that single crossing. Walter rode point on the combined herd, nearly 3,000 head strong, the largest single-drive Canyon Creek had ever seen, and Charlotte rode alongside him rather than behind, her rifle across her saddle, her split canvas skirt streaked with trail dust, looking every inch the rancher's daughter she had been raised to be. They came around the last bend before the bridge shortly after noon to find Sila's Prout already waiting, flanked by Garrett Voss and 6 armed men, standing squarely in the center of the crossing with the toll gate lowered behind him. "This bridge is closed for repairs," Prout called out, as the herd slowed and bunched behind Walter and Charlotte, dust settling thick over the whole scene. "I posted the notice a week ago. You are welcome to use the ferry, though I doubt it will carry your herd before your buyer contracts expire." "There is nothing wrong with that bridge, Silas," Charlotte called back, her voice steady and carrying, "and every rancher gathered here today knows it. You are not closing this crossing for repairs. You are closing it to starve out every outfit in this valley that has not yet sold you their water rights, exactly the way you tried to starve out my father's ranch with a forged deed and a hired thief." A murmur ran through the assembled ranchers behind her, men and women who had ridden miles that morning specifically to hear this confrontation, and Prout's composed mask flickered for the first time Walter had seen since the morning in the square 2 weeks before. "That is a serious accusation to make in front of witnesses, Miss Wainwright," Prout said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "It is a true one," Charlotte said, "and I have the witnesses to prove it." She turned in her saddle, gesturing, and Sheriff Hutchins rode forward from the crowd, Amos Teague beside him, pale but resolute, and beside them a stern, dust-covered man in a black frock coat that Walter recognized from Hutchins's earlier description as Judge Corwin Ashby, the territorial circuit judge, who had ridden in a full 3 days ahead of his usual schedule at Hutchins's urgent telegraphed request. "Mr. Prout," Judge Ashby said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who had presided over more range disputes than he could count, "I have here a sworn statement from Amos Teague detailing your foreman's role in orchestrating horse thefts throughout this valley to frame innocent ranch hands and pressure landowners into selling their claims. I have testimony from Larkspur Station confirming an unusual purchase of fountain pen ink by your company the very month you claim Thomas Wainwright signed away his water rights, along with sworn statements that Mr. Wainwright was confined to his sickbed with fever the entire period in question and never once traveled to town to sign anything at all. I would strongly advise you to open this bridge immediately and cooperate with this inquiry, rather than add obstruction to the charges already mounting against you." For a long moment, Silas Prout said nothing at all, his eyes moving across the crowd, across the sheer weight of the valley's ranchers gathered behind Charlotte and Walter, across Garrett Voss, whose hand had drifted uneasily toward his revolver, across Amos Teague's pale, unwavering face. "Voss," Prout said finally, low, "put that hand down. This is finished." "Prout," Voss started. "We do not have to," I said. "Put it down," Prout snapped, and something in his voice, the sudden collapse of a man who had run out of moves, made even his own hired men hesitate. Voss's hand fell away from his gun, and the tension that had gripped the whole crossing like a drawn bowstring eased, all at once, into something that felt almost like relief. "This bridge," Judge Ashby said into the silence, "will remain open, Mr. Prout, for every drive that requires it, effective immediately, and you will surrender the deed in question to this court for examination. I expect you understand that failure to comply will result in your immediate arrest, along with Mr. Voss and any other man found to have participated in these thefts." Prout's shoulders sank, the last of his practiced composure draining out of him all at once, leaving behind only a tired, defeated man who had gambled an entire valley's trust and lost it in a single afternoon. "The gate," he said quietly, to no one in particular. Someone raised the gate. The crowd erupted, not into violence but into a great rolling murmur of relief and vindication, and Walter reached over without thinking and gripped Charlotte's hand where it rested on her saddle horn, and she gripped back just as hard, both of them breathing as though they had run the whole distance rather than ridden it. "You did it," Walter said. "Charlotte, you did it. You brought down the most powerful man in this valley with a bottle of ink and a room full of sewing clients." "We did it," Charlotte said again, insistent, though there were tears standing bright in her eyes now that the danger had passed. "I could not have gathered enough proof alone, Walter, and you could not have found Amos Teague's confession without the trust I had already built in this town. This was never one person's fight to win." The gate rose with a groan of old timber and rope, and behind them, 3,000 head of cattle began to move, a great river of dust and noise pouring across the bridge toward Larkspur Station, and the buyers waiting there. Every rancher in the valley crossing free and clear for the first time in over a decade, and Walter Norris, watching it all beside the woman who had changed the entire shape of his future in the space of 2 short weeks, thought he had never in his life seen anything half so beautiful. Silas Prout was arrested that same afternoon, along with Garrett Voss, and both men were held in the Canyon Creek jail to await the territorial court's full proceedings. Judge Ashby, examining the deed with a jeweler's loupe borrowed from the mercantile, confirmed within the week what Charlotte had known from the start. The signature had indeed been added weeks after the body of the document was drafted, the ink chemically distinct under close inspection, and Thomas Wainwright's true handwriting, confirmed against a dozen letters and ledgers Charlotte produced from her father's old desk, bore no resemblance to the smooth, practiced forgery at all. The deed was voided. The Wainwright Ranch, its water rights, and its full 1,400 head of cattle were restored to Charlotte outright, and the Canyon Trust Land Company's remaining assets, seized pending the outcome of the court's investigation into the wider pattern of forged claims across the valley, were placed under temporary stewardship of the town council while a proper accounting could be made. It was in the course of that accounting that the council, led now by a chastened Sheriff Hutchins and a handful of ranchers eager to see the valley made right, discovered that the Canyon Trust Company held a reward fund, some $400 set aside originally as bounty money for the very horse thief Walter had been hired to catch, along with a further sum recovered from Prout's frozen accounts as restitution for the ranchers wronged by his scheme. The council offered the combined sum, nearly $1,000 in all, to Charlotte and Walter jointly, in recognition of what the town's own newspaper had already taken to calling the unraveling of the Canyon Trust conspiracy. They stood together in the town hall, a modest wood frame building that still smelled of fresh sawn pine, facing a council table where Hutchins and 3 of the valley's senior ranchers waited with the money laid out before them in careful stacks. "I do not want it," Charlotte said, before Walter had a chance to speak at all, and he found he was smiling even before she finished, already knowing what she would say. "I have my ranch back, and that is worth more to me than any bounty this council could offer. But that bridge charges every single family in this valley a toll to cross with their own goods and their own cattle, on a structure that Silas Prout built with money that should rightly have been shared among the whole community from the start. I would rather see this money go toward buying the bridge outright, free and clear, so that no single man ever again holds the power to starve out an entire valley on a whim." Walter looked at her, at the fierce practical generosity of the idea, and added his own voice without hesitation. "I would add to that," he said, "that this valley could use a proper doctor's office as well, closer than the 2 days' ride to Larkspur Station. I have seen too many good hands lose a hand or a life to infection that a trained doctor could have saved, out on drives where the nearest help was 3 days off. If there is money enough left over after the bridge is bought free, I would see it spent there." The council members exchanged glances, clearly moved, and Hutchins cleared his throat, looking suddenly uncomfortable in the way of a man unused to witnessing generosity so plainly offered. "That is a fine gesture," he said. "Are you certain, the both of you, this is no small sum you are turning down?" "We are certain," Charlotte said, glancing sideways at Walter, who nodded once firm. "This valley gave my father everything he built in his lifetime, Sheriff. It seems only right that whatever comes from tearing down the man who tried to steal it should go back into making that valley stronger for everyone who calls it home." The council agreed, and within the month a new sign went up at the bridge house declaring the crossing toll-free for all time, funded by the town of Canyon Creek in memory of Thomas Wainwright, and ground was broken for a small doctor's office 2 streets over from Charlotte's rebuilt shop. Its front window, glazed with good clean glass, and stocked already with bolts of new cloth in blues and greens that caught the afternoon light like something out of a finer city than any frontier canyon town had a right to hold. The wedding, when it came, was a modest affair, held in late August under a stand of cottonwoods at the edge of the Wainwright Ranch, with the whole valley invited and most of it in attendance. Charlotte wore a dress of her own making, pale ivory silk she had ordered specially from Denver and cut, and stitched herself over the course of 3 quiet evenings. The finest work of her career, she said, and no one who saw her walking down the grassy aisle on the arm of Sheriff Hutchins, who had asked for the honor of standing in her late father's place, doubted the truth of it for a moment. Walter stood waiting beneath the cottonwoods in a new dark suit that fit him a little stiffly, having spent far more years in chaps and dusters than in tailored broadcloth, and when Charlotte reached him he leaned close and murmured, low enough for only her to hear, "I believe this is the first time I have ever seen you in something you did not make with a purpose beyond looking beautiful." "I made this dress with a purpose," Charlotte whispered back, fighting a smile as the preacher cleared his throat to begin. "The purpose was you." The ceremony itself was brief, as frontier weddings tended to be, but the vows they spoke to one another were not the plain formalities most couples exchanged. Walter, when his turn came, spoke of a woman who had taught him that courage did not always look like a gun in a steady hand, that sometimes it looked like a needle held up to catch the light, that he had ridden into Canyon Creek expecting to find a simple case of stolen horses, and had instead found the whole shape of his future standing in a town square with a forged deed raised toward the sun. Charlotte, when her turn came, spoke of a man who had never once mistaken her gentleness for weakness after that first mistaken morning, who had trusted her judgment before he had any proof to justify it, and who had chosen, of his own free will after a lifetime of solitary drifting, to plant his roots in the very ground her father had spent his whole life defending. When the preacher pronounced them married, the whole gathered valley cheered loud enough to send a flock of startled meadowlarks up from the tall grass beyond the cottonwoods, and Walter kissed his bride beneath the late summer sky with the easy, unhurried certainty of a man who had finally, after years of hard trails and harder losses, found the one crossing worth staying on the far side of. They settled into the Wainwright Ranch house together that autumn, Charlotte running her sewing business 3 days a week in town, and the ranch accounts the rest, while Walter took over the day-to-day work of the herd, his years of trail experience proving invaluable in building the outfit back up stronger than it had ever been under threat of Prout's schemes. He never did go back to driving other men's cattle across other men's ranges. He had found, at last, a stretch of ground worth staying put on, and a woman beside him who had never once needed rescuing so much as she had needed a partner willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with her while she did the rescuing herself. Silas Prout was convicted that autumn on charges of forgery and conspiracy, and Garrett Voss alongside him, both men sentenced to hard years at the territorial prison, while Amos Teague, in recognition of his testimony, was given a suspended sentence, and a second chance he used well, taking honest work at the Bar W Ranch under a foreman who remembered, better than most, what it looked like when a frightened man finally found the courage to tell the truth. The bridge over Copper Gorge stood open and toll-free through every summer that followed, its worn timbers carrying cattle drives and wagon trains, and, in time, the occasional buggy bearing a Wainwright Norris child down to town for school, though that particular chapter of their story unfolded slowly, in its own good season, built on the same patient, steady foundation as everything else the two of them had made together. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the light went gold over the canyon rim exactly as it had the first summer they met, Charlotte Norris would sometimes take out an old, worn deed from the bottom drawer of her sewing table, the very document that had started it all, its false signature long since annulled by the territorial court, and show it to whichever visitor happened to ask about the valley's history. "This," she would say, tracing the too smooth ink with one finger, "is what happens when a man mistakes a needle for a weakness. And this," she would add, glancing across the room to where Walter sat mending a bit of harness by lamplight, looking up at her with the same steady, devoted attention he had given her from that very first morning in the town square, "is what happens when the right man learns better,